I noticed quite a few ladies turned out to see him, but as one of his bodyguards while he's here, I have to warn you that he's quite married. So while you can ask for his autograph, you're not getting his phone number. He doesn't like it when I embarrass him like this, but I have to tell you that as big shots go, and because I was a journalist, I've made quite a few, he's by far the humblest one I've ever met. Ladies and gentlemen, to close the show like the star he is, please put your hands together and welcome a true gentleman and a scholar, Mr. Peter Blair Henry.
I'm a born Jamaican, I'm a son of the sun. Sweet Jamaica is now on the move. Help me with my song and let the people them come sing along. Today we sow, tomorrow we reap. Then everything will be sweet, sweet, sweet.
Thank you, Tony. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a better economist than I am a dancer, so hopefully this presentation will be better than my dancing. It is an honor to be back at the Bank of Jamaica. Just a little bit of history. I was at the Bank of Jamaica in the summer of 1995 as an intern in the research department. Wayne Robinson, the director of research, is no longer here. He had to leave, but I worked with him closely that summer as well as with a number of other people here. So it's a genuine pleasure to be back, and I'm thrilled to be running the anchor leg of the relay, as it were. There are four of us, and so I'm taking the baton, and my colleagues have done, I think, a really tremendous job of explaining to you some of the hard work, the details of, what is inflation, why does it matter, how do we track it, looking at international comparisons of cost and relating it to the exchange rate. These are all very, very important micro details as to how inflation works as you pursue an inflation target. So what I want to do with my time here today, and you've been very patient, so I want to move as a proper anchor should fairly quickly through this anchor leg, is to give you the historical backdrop and talk to you about how did we arrive at this place. Because when I was here in 1995, we actually worked on a small inflation targeting model for the Bank of Jamaica, but it was very, very early days, and in some ways, it was kind of even extraordinary that at the time, given all that was happening in the economy, that we were even working on inflation targeting, because inflation was nowhere near being in a range where you could actually talk seriously about an inflation target and that people take it credibly. So that's what I want to do. I want to give you a historical backdrop and talk about the road to reform that actually got Jamaica to the point where it could be in a serious discussion about inflation targeting. My colleagues have done a very good job of explaining why you need an inflation target as an anchor for the economy. And what I want to talk about is how. How do you do it? What's going to be necessary to make that happen and to make it stick? And really want to just leave you with 2 points, if you take nothing else away from what I'm going to say today. Number one, I'm going to talk about discipline. Discipline is how we got to this point, and discipline is how we're going to stay here. So, discipline in the first instance to arrive at this auspicious place, but in order to get to the place we all want to get to, which is a place of greater prosperity, sustained prosperity, it's going to require more and more and more and more and more of the hard work that has gotten us to this point. All right, so the ideas that make up this idea of discipline I talk about them in a book I published in 2013, Turnaround, Third World Lessons for First World Growth, for those of you who are interested. Much of that book is derived from my Jamaican childhood here. I don't sound like I'm from Jamaica. I apologize for my Yankee accent, but I was born in Kingston, grew up in St. Mary. My father is from St. Elizabeth. So, on we go. So, the Bank of Jamaica has done an extraordinary job of communicating its policies. And you heard the governor lead off by saying that the explanation is sometimes the policy. And I think Tony has done, and his team have done a fabulous job of really, frankly, taking to the world a new approach to communicating central bank policy. And we've heard from the fabulous young man in his group, Mr. Bennett, singing to us. Let's give him another round of applause for communicating. And you know, it's extraordinary when I first saw the advertisements, the little videos that the Bank of Jamaica was doing. I saw it on Twitter and I was stunned. I couldn't believe it. And I said to myself, why isn't the Fed doing this? Right? Why are other central banks around the world doing this? And of course, Jamaica is always a leader, right? And so in many ways, what I want to say to you this morning is, we need, what Jamaica really needs to do to continue to make inflation targeting work is to take the flavor that we have, but combine it with focus. You need both focus and flavor. And so this road to reform, predictable, slow, and stable inflation has been a long journey, and I'm going to show you some of the twists and turns that we've taken along the way to get here. And sometimes, frankly, the car has been in the ditch on the side of the road in the past. And I want to talk about why that happened and what we need to do to prevent that from happening again. All right, so as I said, how do we make inflation targeting stick? And I've said the key is discipline. What do we mean by discipline? Discipline does not necessarily mean doing the most extreme measures. Sometimes you need to raise interest rates to very high levels, but sometimes you need to take a more gradual approach. And whether you're in that situation that requires elevation of interest rates or a more moderate approach really depends on the circumstances in the economy. So discipline does not necessarily mean taking extreme positions. What discipline means is a sustained commitment to a pragmatic growth strategy. And a sustained commitment that is importantly both is vigilant, but is also flexible and temperate. What do I mean by that? As anybody who's whether you run a large business or a small business or just run a household, you have to have a vision. And what is it you want for your kids? What is it you want for your organization? So that's called your strategy. But circumstances change, right? Maybe you want to send your kids to high school, and you had a plan to do that, but you lose your job, bus fare goes up, something changes. That's a shock. So when there's shocks, you have to change your tactics, the approach you're taking to reach that long-run strategy. So bus fare goes up doesn't mean you're not going to send your kid to high school, but you have to change your approach. It's no different than economic policy. You have to have a vision, low stable inflation, stable current account balance, and ultimately productivity. It's been mentioned several times here today. Growth, prosperity, that's the vision. But depending on what shocks hit the economy, again, especially when you're a small country like Jamaica, you have to be agile, okay? You have to be agile. So for the way and the other way I explain discipline is you don't just wake up one morning. You might wake up one morning and decide, you know what, I want to be an Olympic champion, okay? But you don't get to be an Olympic champion by one day going out to the track and running 2,500-meter dashes and then going home, eating patties, spice bun, right, sweetie, and you take a week off. You have to have consistent, sustained, persistent dedication to that vision of being a 100-meter champion that you practice every day, in and out, consistently. That's all discipline is. When we moved to the States in the late 1970s, I remember when I was in high school, about 5 years later, in the early 1980s, my father was not a man of many words, but he had a very wise way of using old-time Jamaican sayings to convey his point. When I was in high school, I had been a very bright student in the lower grades. When I got to high school, I got a little distracted. I was focused on my sports, probably a little too much on trying to fit in and be cool. So I wasn't studying the way I knew how to study, and it was reflected in my performance. But I thought I could kind of pull a little wool over my father's eyes, and so I got in this habit of, I'd be in my room studying at night, not necessarily studying all that hard, but I would spread out my papers and my books all over my bed, make it seem like I was working really hard in the night, and pull the covers over my head, but have all the books spread out, to make it look like I was working. And I remember my father said to me one time, he said, very, very simply, because he knew I was taking shortcuts. He said, Peter, long road draw sweat, shortcut draw blood. And I knew exactly what he meant. And for him, he didn't need to see how hard I was working, because he cared about the outcome. And inflation target is the same way. He looked at my grades, and he knew whether I was working or not. You look at the inflation target, and you see whether people are doing their job or not. You look at the actual inflation. Is the inflation close to the target? If so, you're doing your job. If not, you need to make an adjustment. So that's why an inflation target is a good measure of whether economic policymakers are performing, are being disciplined. Okay? So let's talk about discipline in historical context. So historically, since independence, we've had our struggles. And I think the simplest way to understand the struggles we've had with discipline is to look at economic performance since independence. And I put up here a comparison with Barbados, which has been mentioned a few times this morning, for illustrative purposes. So this is an index of economic performance. You can think of it as an index of GDP per capita. And the basic point of the graph is really straightforward. Jamaica is the dashed line, Barbados is the solid line. And what you can see is that basically since the time of independence, Barbados has had steady growth. And notice that through 1972, Jamaica had pretty steady growth as well. But starting in 1972, there was a divergence. Jamaica went into a massive downturn. And Barbados, while there was never any economic miracle in Barbados, Barbados was in Singapore. Barbados continued to grow at roughly 2 or 3% per year. But that steady growth, in comparison to Jamaica's nosedive, led to a big divergence in incomes. So whereas at the time of independence, when Jamaica became independent in 1962, Barbados got its independence in 1966, if you looked at the two countries at that point in time, Barbados had a per capita income of about $3,300 or so. Jamaica, at the time of independence, was about $2,200. So about an $1,100 difference between the two countries. Today, the difference between the two countries, just the difference between the per capita incomes, that gap is larger than Jamaica's overall standard of living. So big, big opening. Now, someone mentioned earlier shocks. And certainly there were shocks that were out of the control of Jamaica that hit the economy, particularly in 1973. In 1973, there was an oil price shock. OPEC countries raised their prices. And when oil prices go up and you import a lot of oil, that raises production costs, raises the cost of fuel. I mentioned the cost of sending children to school. Bus fare goes up. It affects everything. Okay? Also, in 1979, there was something called the Saturday Night Special in the United States. The chairman of the Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker, raised interest rates. The federal funds rate, which is now stands at about somewhere around 1.5%, was raised to 20% overnight, unannounced. And it was called a Saturday Night Special in reference to it being like a massacre. And so that was also an external shock. People say when the U.S. economy gets a cold, Jamaica gets pneumonia. So there were definitely two big external shocks in the 70s. Okay? But, it's a very important but. This is the reason why Barbados is up here. Guess what? Barbados was subject to the exact same shocks as Jamaica. Right? Both small countries, both countries suffered from the fact that oil prices were higher, interest rates in the United States went up. So in other words, you can't blame what happened in Jamaica on the oil price shock or Volcker's recession. This was a real challenge, but the ways in which collectively policymakers in Jamaica, over time, both parties, responded to these changed circumstances was less than optimal, to put it mildly. So I won't go into all the details of all the things that happened. Jermaine covered a number of them in his presentation. But let me just say that, comparison with Barbados makes it very hard to embrace the conclusion that external shocks alone were responsible for the economic performance in Jamaica. There was at the time, and it wasn't just monetary policy. It was both on the monetary side, the Bank of Jamaica, frankly, during that time period, and legislators pursued a set of policies that were just incompatible with the reality that Jamaica was facing. And let me make it very concrete. So when we've talked about inflation targeting this morning, and people, and I believe it was in both in Constance's presentation and also in Courtney's presentation, they talked about the need to adjust to shocks and the need to diversify your economy. And it's true. When an oil price shock happens, it raises the cost of production. And it raises lots of costs in the economy. So the question is, what do you do when that happens? Okay? The tempting thing to do for monetary policy is to lower interest rates, because the temptation is if you lower interest rates, the producers who are being hit by this cost shock, you lower their borrowing costs, make things a little bit easier. The problem with that is when there's a real shock that happens to the rest of the world, you need to adjust over time. You need to change the way in which you produce things to adjust to the fact that the price of oil is now higher. And that takes time. That problem can't be solved by changing interest rates, because if you lower interest rates in that circumstance, all you do is you create more demand by making money easier at a time when supply is being restricted. And we've talked a lot about supply and demand this morning. So if you're pumping up demand when supply is being restricted, guess what's going to happen to inflation? Prices are going to go up. And so a lot of what happened, not just in Jamaica, but particularly in Jamaica around this period of time, is you had monetary policy being accommodative to the shock. In other words, instead of communicating, we need to change, right? We've been hit by a real shock to the world economy. We need to change our way of doing things and adjust. It's much easier. Turn on the pipe, pump some more money in the economy. It's also much easier on the political side, from the point of view of legislators, rather than to communicate to the population, boy, times are hard. We have to tighten the belt. We have tough things you have to do. Much easier to spend a little more, right? Give people the increases in bus fare. Hard things, okay? No, it's not easy to tell somebody they need to make adjustments. You need to walk halfway, or you need to, spend a little less money on entertainment to save adjustments are much harder to communicate, much harder to get people to accept than it is to turn on the monetary spigot, open the purse, and give out more money in the short run. But as my grandparents used to say, what are you going to do when the money done? Right? So this is what happened. In 1972, investment as a fraction of GDP was 26%. So there was a relatively good investment climate in Jamaica. By 1980, it had fallen to 14%. Why had it fallen to 14%? A number of things were happening. I won't get into all of it, but in response to the deficit that came about in the current account because of higher oil prices and so forth, we put on import restrictions. And we put on quotas and said you can only import things if you have a license. And guess what? That led to corruption, right? So who gets access to the shortage of licenses? And so then all of a sudden you have people trying to patch the economy various different ways rather than letting market forces work. And all of a sudden you find yourself in a deeper and deeper hole. Okay? So spending, this is no mistake now. Government spending in 1972 was about 23% of GDP, which is about where it is in most advanced countries, somewhere around 18, 20%. By 1978, Government spending was 45% of GDP. The government was trying to play a larger and larger role in the economy. Not feasible. Not feasible. Okay? Fiscal deficit. Between 1962 and 1972, Jamaica averaged a fiscal deficit of 2.3% of GDP. From 1973 to 1980, the average fiscal deficit, 15.5% of GDP. Right? That's the consequence of not accepting reality. Not accepting reality. And inflation, not surprisingly, and this is where, frankly, Bank of Jamaica is under new management than it was at the time, but I'm just going to say it bluntly. When inflation goes from 4.4% to 27%, the monetary authority is being accommodative and is not doing its job. So you have both the fiscal pressures and the monetary accommodation leading to 27% inflation. Okay? And by comparison, Barbados had some increase in inflation, but never reached double-digit inflation during this period of time. Barbados' deficits were below 7% of GDP this entire time. So they went through tough times too, but again, the consequence? Contraction for 13 straight years of the Jamaican economy. Things came back. Liberalization in the 90s helped things some, but still, pretty stagnant economy for roughly 40 years. And again, bipartisan stagnation. Okay, so plenty of blame to go around. All right, so and high inflation, as we know, we've seen, is a monster. Nothing further needs to be said about that. It's bad for the economy, bad for everybody, particularly the poor. And so we've talked a lot about low, stable, and predictable inflation. And we've heard that's the heartbeat of the economy. Reggae runs the economy, but look at this history of Jamaica. It's the green line. Inflation was anything but low, stable, and predictable for years and years and years. Okay? So the question is why? We've already seen some hints of it. Fiscal deficits and the monetary side. I'm going to come back to the monetary side, but let's talk about the fiscal situation. There was no fiscal discipline. We need fiscal discipline, but there was no fiscal discipline. The fiscal side of the economy, large government deficits for extended periods of time, put pressure on the system. Put pressure on the system. Because you have the government, when you have government spending as much as it was, buying up goods and services effectively, crowding out investment, pushing up prices when there's no production to match it. It puts pressure on inflation and creates a situation that's called fiscal dominance. Fiscal dominance just means that the government is too involved in the economy. It's dominating the scene. Okay? And you can see that when you look at, again, at this graph of the fiscal deficit as a fraction of GDP. Now, Jermaine talked about this in his presentation, and you can see the trend from 1990 through 2009. It's a clear downward trend, meaning the fiscal deficit as a fraction of GDP is becoming more and more negative. In other words, a negative number means that spending is greater than taxation. Okay. So the deficit is basically taxation minus spending, minus interest revenue, interest payments, and that number was becoming more and more negative, trending down through 2009. So that's fiscal dominance, okay? A couple of things which happened in there. I mentioned 1995, no one could have imagined when I was here in 1995 that Jamaica could credibly have an inflation target. One of the issues was Jamaica had a financial crisis in 1995. Which led to the FinSAC corporation having to be put in place. And Jermaine mentioned that led to a huge fiscal deficit as the government had to absorb the cost and recapitalize a lot of the financial institutions. That was one of the reasons why you had that big fall in the deficit. You see the deficit then improved some going in through 2000, but then begins trending down again. Right? Remember we said discipline means sustained commitment. Not that you reduce the budget deficit one time and then let it go back. And you can see here, if anything, there's sustained fiscal indiscipline going on here until you get to about 2013. I just want to focus on that period, Jermaine used a very important word, continuity. Discipline requires continuity, right? Again, think back to the analogy of somebody training for track and field. You can't go to the track one day and be at home for 5 straight days eating Spice Bun and expect to go out on the 6th day and perform. You have to have a continuous commitment to excellence. And frankly, Jamaica had never had that until this period between 2013 to the present. Something unprecedented happened. All right, so in 2013, there was an agreement with the IMF, but Jamaica's had I think over Jamaica's history since independence, probably 10, maybe a dozen IMF agreements, something close to that. Almost all of which ended up in tatters at some point. This time was different. This time was different. And to my mind, when history gets written, I think one of the key things that history is going to point to was the formation of the Economic Policy Oversight Committee. It's a shame, the first chairman of the Economic Policy Oversight Committee, Richard Biles, who was here earlier, had to leave. I would just say that in absentia, we should give him a round of applause because the Economic Policy Oversight Committee played a major role in cementing that agreement in place. And then remarkably, there was a transition of government in 2016. And across that transition, the IMF agreement held. So for the first time in Jamaica's history, you have essentially a bipartisan embrace of fiscal discipline. And that, to quote Robert Frost, has made all the difference. Again, look at the data. Starting in 2013, you can see what happens to government debt as a percentage of GDP. Again, we all know that the government has reduced the debt as a fraction of GDP, but it's worth saying again and again and again. Fiscal discipline, reduced debt as a fraction of GDP, adherence to a long-term strategy which says we are going to have an economy in which the private sector plays a larger role. The government has a role to play, but it's going to be disciplined about that role. It's going to recognize limitations, and when there's shocks, we're going to adjust as necessary, and we're going to make our spending be on things that are productive for the economy as a whole, not productive in an electoral sense, in a short-term sense. And when you do that, you can see what happens to government spending as a fraction of GDP. It begins to come down. And it was this change in trajectory of government of the debt as a fraction of GDP which allowed the adjustment in inflation to begin to take place. And so now we can talk credibly of inflation targeting. Okay, we can talk credibly of inflation targeting. So come back to this picture of inflation. Look at the trajectory. We go from a period in the mid-'80s and early '90s of really volatile inflation, spiking from time to time, to a point where Jamaica's inflation rate, we talked a lot about why it's important for your inflation rate to be close to your trading partners. The blue line are the advanced economies. The red line are the other emerging economies. And you can see Jamaica slowly, and particularly starting again, kind of post-2010, inflation rate starts to converge. It comes down and is now actually a little bit below the average inflation rate in emerging economies. There's still a gap. I think Anthony mentioned, Courtney mentioned that inflation rate was about 3.9%. In the U.S. advanced economies, it's about 1.9%. So it's about 2 percentage point gap. So there's still a gap there. But it's now incredibly low. And importantly, it's been low for a long period of time. So we're moving into a range that is credible, that has the chance of providing exchange rate stability, not through market intervention, but through fundamentals, right? So basically, as long as the inflation rate is about 2% higher than the U.S., you'll have about 2% depreciation a year, and that's natural. But if you actually get to the point where the inflation rate gets even closer to the U.S. rate, you'll get to a point where there'll be negligible movements in the exchange rate over time. And that's ultimately the goal, and that's why, again, don't look at the exchange rate. Look at inflation, right? Don't look at all the books that are spread around on the bed. Look at the grades. And the Bank of Jamaica said, grade us on inflation. So you take that seriously and hold them to that. So the question then is, when will we reach? Because we haven't reached the destination yet. There's this fancy new car that the Bank of Jamaica is very rightly excited about, called inflation targeting. It's got a sound engine, financial stability. On the real side of the economy, there's now fiscal stability. But other things need to happen. And here's where the conversation is bigger than the Bank of Jamaica, and why I think it's so important that the Bank of Jamaica is having these conversations with the general public. Certainly, the public needs to hold the Bank of Jamaica accountable to its inflation target. But very importantly, if we go back to the first graph that I showed you of the divergence in income, the public also needs to hold its legislators, its politicians accountable, right? Because we've gotten away from fiscal dominance, and now we need structural reform, right? We need to continue to make Jamaica an easier place to do business, and we've seen some of those things happen, right? We've seen reduction in transfer tax. We've seen an attempt to really begin to remove some of the red tape in the economy. These are all good things. And they have to work hand in hand with inflation targeting and monetary stability to create a more dynamic environment, to really allow that growth that everyone wants to see happen. Now, a word of caution. If you think back to the first graph that I showed you, the economy from essentially 1962 through 2010, but imagine extending that graph forward to 2019, 57 years of an independent economy. 6 years of discipline. 6 years marked, starting in 2013 to the present time, bipartisan cooperation, continuity, commitment to fiscal discipline. So 6 years and 57, those are low marks from a global context, a historical context. That's the bad news. The great news is the last 6 years is 6 out of 6. That's 100%. That's a good grade. But it has to continue. So my answer to the question is, when will we reach? We'll know we reached when the market lady and the man in the street understand well enough, and we've communicated well enough, and the onus is on the policymakers, frankly, to communicate well enough so the man in the street and the market lady understand well enough the importance of inflation targeting, the importance of creating a stable business environment and make it easy to do business, then they're the ones who pick up their cell phone and call their representative and say, what are you doing? What are you doing to support and make sure we're hitting this inflation target? What are you doing to make sure we're driving financial inclusion? What are you doing to make Jamaica a more friendly business environment? When the people begin to hold both policymakers on the monetary side and on the real side of the economy accountable, when there's demand for good policy, so that the kind of thing which happened between 2013 and the 2016 transition, some might say it's a miracle. We don't want miracles. We want to rely on miracles. Miracles are great. I went to Sunday school too. but God helps those who help themselves. So we want to make sure that that kind of policy continuity is not a miracle, but it in itself becomes an expectation and demand that the people put on the policymakers. So we'll know we reached when the market lady and the man in the street understand inflation targeting, financial inclusion, and investment climate, and are demanding more. So with that, let me say that I'm very optimistic about what's happening. It's extraordinary to me, the turnaround in Jamaica. There's a long way to go, but there's no reason to believe that we can't do it. Let me restate that. There's every reason to believe we can do it. But it's going to take commitment to excellence, not just on the part of the policymakers, because we get the policymakers we deserve. And so we have to hold people accountable. But I'm optimistic. So congratulations to the Bank of Jamaica and us reaching this point. And frankly, as an outsider, a proud Jamaican living abroad, congratulations to Jamaica on its well-deserved attention that it's capturing from the rest of the world. And I would just say, the world is watching us run, so let's run well. It's an important race. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. A big hand for Peter once again, please, ladies and gentlemen. And do we have any questions for the gentleman? Yes, sir.
Excellent presentation.
Thank you.
What I hear you essentially saying, and this is just going back to your work on Barbados, A Tale of Two Islands. You're saying, listen, it's not a case that you inherited bad institutions from the colonial period. The comparative context shows we just chose bad macroeconomic policies in the first instance. And now we have apparently chosen the better set of macroeconomic policies. Now let's build the institutions to support it. That is what I get from, in practical terms, what you mean by discipline.
Yes, sir.
Build those institutions to support the macroeconomic policies. So my question to you is, in your professional opinion, what we have done thus far on the road to building those institutions, the establishment of the fiscal council, where are some ways on getting the central bank almost fully independent. Are those, in your view, adequate? What other things we can pursue to ensure this discipline that you speak about?
Great question. I'm glad you brought that up because I had meant to mention it, but I did not. So in particular on the central bank independence legislation, these are what I would say are necessary but not sufficient, but absolutely necessary, right? I think we want to be in a position where the inflation target is not being set by someone on the political side, but by the independent monetary authority, right? So again, we'll only reach when, the market lady, the man in the street are calling up their representative and saying, make sure you vote for the, for the independence legislation, because that is critical to laying the foundation, to laying permanent independence between monetary policy and fiscal policy, because a reason why we had accommodated fiscal policy in the past was also because essentially the Bank of Jamaica was monetizing the debt of the central government. So you want to move away from that. But in addition, that in of itself is not sufficient. You've heard a lot of conversation this morning, the importance of the investment climate, and how businesses, in my view, not surprisingly, are kind of putting their toe in the water because they're not sure, is this a permanent change or is this a temporary change? We had one period of steady transition across governments. Will we continue to see commitment to this climate? And so to me, things like the change in the transfer tax, to make it easier to buy and sell property, right? Really, really very important. And why is that so important? Just to articulate why I think that particular tax reduction is so important. So when I first started looking into the cost of doing business in Jamaica back in the early 2000s, and I've given the same advice to every party that's approached me for input, I said, it's, you know, when you have when the cost of transferring property is 13.5% of the value of the property, that undermines the economy in two very important ways. Number one, obviously it makes people reluctant to engage in legitimate transactions. Okay, so first of all, you're not getting any revenue from that. Number two, it's very inefficient from a legal point of view because the court is jammed with property disputes because people don't have titles to land. And the third problem with that was that in the past, before there was a public credit registry in Jamaica, and you had people, let's say small business owners, no title to the land, going in to try to get a loan, even putting aside the problem of high interest rates, if you have no title to the land and there's no public credit registry, no credit record, how are you going to get a loan? And so these inefficiencies like the transfer tax have a way of snowballing and creating more and more bottlenecks in the economy. And so the job now on the real side is to continue to dismantle inefficient red tape. I'm not saying get rid of all regulation because you need the government to safeguard the economy. But getting a mindset of being a facilitator rather than a regulator, so to speak, is really important. So yes, inflation targeting, central bank independence, necessary but not sufficient. But yes, we need to continue to build the institutions.